Today we're going to draw the monument of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I am going to use water-soluble watercolor pencil and really pull the contrast between light and shadow, as you can see in this image, is going to be one of the key references for me to focus on, and just trying to be descriptive and simplify those shadow shapes. We see the light shapes, shadow shapes, and then we get to play with textures. So a lot of this, although it's marble and rock, we're going to try to define where we see rock, hair, skin, and suit or fabric, and try to make the best out of these values and stretching these techniques to create a nice and gestural, expressive study of this beautiful monument. Let's get to it. So notice here I have it's more of a square, but I have an area down here, and I'll show you a little bit better. Plenty of paper here to do lots of these value tests, because the intricacy of this drawing will be, for me, a lot of the value play and how I can create better expression with some of those details in the face and the hands. Well, all across we have beautiful textures on the rock, nice beautiful shadow shapes. So here we have it. My cold pressed watercolor paper with a nice frame. As I mentioned, I'm going to be working specifically, the study will be lights and shadows, so that's going to be all black and white, but I may do a little bit of color, watercolor for the sky, and that's the reason for the frame. And then the tests that I'll be doing down here in this area, you'll be able to see some of them, just to make sure I am, in terms of value and also in terms of moisture, how I apply the technique. So where should I begin? I am going to start, as always, with a quick, just a ghost of a pencil sketch. And this is basically to get my proportion, my ratios. How big is my head in relationship? How important are certain elements? How much to the left or right should I have this be? Do I want it in the center? And then how much of the rock, for example, here? So I think it may pull, because of my composition, a little towards the right. We're going to start with the edges at the top and just pretty basic, a nice straight line study, sort of an envelope. As you decide what will be the appropriate drawing method for you to approach the elements that you want to focus on, I see angles, and you can see it's a very quick, making sure you take some measurements. And looking for those fundamental lines, the structural foundational lines, some of these diagonals, some of the angles. Beginning to see some of the figures, the shoulder, the neck, back of the neck. But once again, how detailed this drawing needs to be to serve its purpose. It's not just, it never goes into actual complexity. It's going to be just that simple line study. And if anything, I want to map out a few of these lines that show me sharp shift in shadow. So for example, this cast shadow that happens right here under this elbow, to me it's important. I'm going to go just a little bit further with, you see this beautiful shadow right here, and that's part of the suit. So just a little bit of that angle and the curvature, but that also places me right here at trying to simplify the shapes and the size of this hand. And I will do that very, very gesturally. I just want simple geometric shapes here. And if any, it becomes once again, an envelope for it. So I could show you here how much detail beyond this it needs. I will spend the time on those shapes and lines when I'm using the medium that I plan to, which is the watercolor pencil or the ink pen. With this one, I also am going to be zooming in a lot, especially here, because I really want to break down those shadow shapes. Let's put this up here. And make it a really, again, it's not about the details. I'm looking a little more for contrast, obviously likeness, but more of an expression through the medium. And that becomes a little bit risky. So testing it, strategizing it, planning it. Visualizing and making sure you're willing to take risks. Visualizing and strategizing, very different than executing. Once you have that, best advice I can give you is, as long as possible, keep it open. What does that mean? Your open drawing that is able to still shift even back to an area where you can control. And here it is, that beautiful light, where you can control the technique to the point where you're not losing all of the work. So it's a little bit of that give and take, allowing the work to speak, tell you what you see, what's going on, as you also have your say. So here we are, first area. And again, I know it already looks complete as a portrait here, but it has been just the shapes of light and some of the shapes of shadow where, as you can see, there's nice three-dimensional, beginning to move away from line and shape into what almost reads as form now. But I don't want to go too far with it or too specific. Otherwise, I would just have to shift the medium now. But again, it's how safe do you feel when you're ready to move to the next stage. And whatever that stage is, here we are zooming in again. Here's where I'm going to play and take my time with all of the shapes and shifting values in and around the nose. I think this could have been just a beautiful, big, huge portrait of only just the face. And you could have had tons of fun rearranging that composition with all of the values and beautiful things that are going around the mouth, the eyes, and the nose. And again, with simplicity, beautiful light shapes. And we're going to have to be really aware, because at the moment that I decide to become more expressive, it's how do I keep control of some of these more delicate areas of light, preserving the light, or if I decide to go into adding of textures and line. There we are. I'm going to lighten this up just a little bit, get a little bit of cleanup going, and I think we're ready. So yes, it's a little bit nerve-wracking when you're about to test the first one. So I decided to add a little area down here, and it also helps me see. I'm looking at the pace of some of these lines, see it in the level of drawing, just the lightness of it. And we'll do the same with the brush, just a quick and begin to get a sense of the range of these values. Now that's where the technique, what I meant by keeping it under control, but while trying to be gestural and expressive, it's a very, very tightrope kind of balancing act where you don't want absolute control, but you have to know what your technique allows. And the more you practice, it's basically that, the more you experience with it, in order to understand the brush, the moisture on the brush, the type of line that will deliver. I'm going to do a little bit of scumbling here. Very, very light pressure scumbling for some of these textures that I see. And I'm going to bring in also a bit of scumbling with my brush. See what I get. And you can begin to see already a difference. I'll give you a little bit of a closer look. So here we are. We have the ink pen, and I kind of went back on this one and added extra water. So you see it could be lighter, but this was definitely darker. I just lightened it. This is the watercolor pencil, and beginning to see the qualities on, I don't know if you could see the material itself, how the ink, it's a little, I would call it more, the word would be kind of metallic. This would be more mineral, more rocky. You could actually see the grit in it. Some of the grain. And this was the scumble. Let's go ahead and try a scumble that's a little bit heavier or more circular. And I'm thinking already areas, for example, the hair or near the rock. So this is just a bit heavier pressure. I could do it more saturated as well, a saturated scumble. And I'm going to bring in, and I know this is my brush because I really love the way this brush brings in heavy moisture, but also just with a couple of dabs on my paper towel here, I roll it, or I could get a sense and precision. So it covers a big range. I could go wide and just thick. It gives me that expression, that gesture. Or I could go very light, very thin. So from very dry to very, very wet. From very pointy to very, very thick. And notice there, qualities of texture. Two more. Got to try the scumble. And I'm going to try to do a light scumble. But this time I'm going to use the fountain pen. So it's, again, level of pressure. Level of saturation. And I'm going to do one right by the side with a little heavier. And maybe I'll break the scumble into just dots. Like a little bit of stippling. Almost circular or semicircular stippling. Just to do a variation on the texture here. See what happens. But you notice it is darker, it is heavier. It doesn't look it, but there's a lot more ink content on this one here. And we'll go back to the brush. Really, really play with the understanding the level of your moisture. A little less water or a little more water here will do. And notice also the way I scumble the brush. Oh, and this is a beautiful texture. And the level of pressure. I'm sort of dancing with it, letting it pop up and down, meaning the level of pressure, I'm almost dabbing it in. And that could be really interesting. It got really heavy, of course, but there's nice value shifts. And let's do this one here. And I'm going to do sort of the same sort of scumble motion, dabbing, pushing, dragging, and immediately you see how I could keep areas that are a little wider, preserving some of that space, and bring in a little extra water. That'll look interesting down at the end. So there we are, all these different qualities, and you could just spend all day here testing, practicing, but the idea is to bring all of this, and look how simple, all the way to more and more and more complex, but bring it into our actual piece. So that's what it is. As I always say, it's fun. It's about you becoming a mad scientist and saying how all of these things, one of these things down here, can begin to show you the way, and a mixture of them. So I think for the first layer, I will start with the watercolor pencil once again. And I'm going to apply the simplest to more complex method. And I'm also going to pay attention, darkest, in this case, lightest to darkest, but I want to really squint, and I want to squint this at it for a little while until I'm absolutely sure and I could see those shadow shapes. So yes, as I look at the shadow shapes, I'm also seeing the light, but my focus right now is darkest. Just so I could sort of make a note. And the reason for that is I could pull from the darkest, and I know it's usually the opposite. We go from lightest to darkest. Here I just want to point out, this is one where I actually see it, and I want to start from there by adding just a touch of water. And since most of the work I need to do here will be based on contrast, and again, it's contrast of light and shadow, contrast of texture, contrast of sharpness or blurriness, contrast of softness or harsh, how harsh in terms of edges. All of those different levels of contrast, I want to make sure I get a good read. I know what my widest will be, it's the paper, so I need just a measure of what the darkest would be. And this still would not be the darkest. It could get a little darker because I could layer it, but at least it gives me a sort of point of reference. So that's why I'm going a little bit backwards this time here. I could begin to just splash that and make it into, take advantage of it. And I can begin to see it already. So the quality of this line, using my reference, I got to zoom in a lot. There we are. And be able to navigate with it where I begin to consider the first shifts, and it's going to be a lot of back and forth. You'll see me go from the pencil to the brush, back to the pencil, but I don't want to draw. This medium is not, it doesn't, at least for me, it doesn't handle well when drawing on wet. So I'll let it dry just a little bit, but just adding a tiny bit of a second layer here for that harsh shadow that comes right off of the face into this cast shadow area here. And then that softness of the rounding of the face. And once again, squinting and trying to spot. There's, of course, as I mentioned, lots and lots of shadow shapes. I'm going to the extremes here. The extremes where I can actually see or almost call that a extreme value in terms of shadows. So most of the time you're looking at cast shadows. And again, here we begin to deal with also a little bit of textures. And more of these shadow shapes. Now, bigger washes, the only thing I am going to be really considering here with care is preserving the contrast between some of these sharp shadow edges and where I see some of that direct sunlight. Really want to make sure that. So I'm beginning to extend some of that wash. You could see it very, very light. And as I push the technique a little bit further, that actually applies to what I would call my, it's not a mid-tone, but it's a lot lighter, and it does actually serve its purpose for now. So I'm going to begin to loosen up. Now that I have my point of reference, and you can almost see, it's beautiful how magical it is. Once you go from the line and you apply just a little bit of water, and we begin to sense that light and shadow, the illusion begins to form. And understanding how you manipulate these formulas of contrast, because that's all it is. Something that stays lighter, something that goes darker, and how it creates a three-dimensional illusion. We begin to see how this thing here occupies a space because, well, it's how light behaves. And that is pretty much the whole secret there. Everything else, as I said, is just play, play, play. And now it's getting a little dark here. Let's go back to the brush. And here, where I could get a little more expressive with the technique, also with the line. But again, I'm just testing, knowing that it's going to get much, much darker. But look how beautiful just the tiny shift in value here creates that sensation of breaking away from the rock. I lost a little bit of line there. I would recommend, if you're using water-soluble materials or inks, testing different brushes also. Making sure you found the brush that gives you the qualities. Because remember, you're still drawing. And this is drawing. And once you begin to draw with values, it's the quality of those, in this case, brush strokes that create those lines. And here we begin to get just a little bit more. As I said, I tested the scumble, and I loved what the ink one did, but gotta wait it out. And I'm gonna do it step by step. Also, noticing that you can add texture by drawing it. So some of these lines, as they get just a little bit harsher, through the pencil or through the brush, I can begin to create that illusion, in this case of the hair, the texture of it. But notice how the light is still the main concern. I'm going to do this in layers as well. Now that we have shadow shapes here, I know we have a little bit of rounding. I'm going to try to pull this line again from a little bit of patience. And sometimes that little bit of patience, it's really the only way you can really have fun. So patience, generally speaking, it's, oh, well, it's going to be boring. That means you got to slow down and do things. Somehow it feels more serious. No, it's patience to know the game and what the kind of follow the rule of the game in order for you to have even more fun with the game. That's what it's about, pretty much. I'm using some of these very, very lights, so as I drag some of this material, I know some of this is going to be much darker, but I'm using this technique, dropping in some water, using that edge, and pulling that material to take full advantage of some of these values. It's really interesting. I'm going to work back and forth. So while this dries a little bit, I'll go down into this area here, or I could go jump back to the hand. Let's go ahead and add a few more lines here. Now I do have some pencil lines here now, where they could be a part of it. How much so? Are they going to be something that I could use to my advantage? Or do I need to clear them up? Might be too late now. You may risk kind of affecting the work. What you have going on already. So here's again, just looking at smaller areas, but in the same, pretty much the same way of just breaking the shadow shapes. Using a lot of brush and paper towel. So I have my paper towel right here. I'll keep it here so you could see how many times, just in order to get a sense of what the material is doing and how to use it by dragging it, pulling it, and be able to create that shift and that very soft, once again, when I go full drag the pigment or dry and lift, basically. And although we have direct light, there's lots of beautiful contour on areas of the face here. But that's what I want. I want to be patient. Let's go ahead and move into some of these. And again, I'm going to use the edge. So this I am going to clear now, just a little bit. Just so there's a hint of it. Light ghost. Because what I want to do later on, and I plan to use a nice blue sky, and I'm going to work the negative space and create the edge of the blue instead of a line, and work basically the opposite direction with maybe some gesture in the sky. But these clear edges between the light, the stone, and the sky will be drawn by the sky, if that makes any sense. And you'll see it come together. It's not the contour, the edges of the stone. It's going to be that bit of sky showing us. Let me add a little extra material here, so we can have all of this area just begin to dry before I come back. There's a little bit of rounder, darker, and the contour begins to really take shape now. Very, very lightly, almost color pencil techniques here. And again, the amount of water we bring in and I want to just begin to drag that brush, allowing some of that expression, gesture, and texture that I mentioned earlier. And that's tricky right here. You have to trust, but think, and time, and do all of that almost simultaneously, while also managing material and, in my case, moisture. Okay, moving back. I'm going to begin to add line work here, and I want to get closer look. A closer look at some of these lines. And some of the break of these shapes. One big one here is going to be this cast shadow on the rock. So I don't want it to be just, and here's that scumble that we did earlier. So using a bit of a different technique, I'm going to try to capture some of that rock texture. And all I'm doing is just adding a little bit of material. But the edge and the shape of the shape of the shadow here. Notice the nice, it takes us back to those early tests we did down at the bottom of the page. And blending right into the hairline here. And let's see how that goes. So again, it's a little bit of that biggest, simplest, and again, these are, I wouldn't call them simple shadow shapes. They begin to have a little bit of that gesture. And yes, there's a sharp edge to the shadow. You could see it there. But there's also edges that then pull away at a different level of value. So I'm going to also try to capture some of that. I'm thinking if I should wait and do that in layers. I like how this stone, notice the difference between the skin and the stone texture. So that scumble will work. But what I'm thinking is, what you want to do is you want to get a lot of the value here. And I'm wondering if the stone needs a little extra value overall. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I do think I need to pull some of this. It'll get easier. Remember, biggest to smallest. So this is a big area. I know it's complex, but the formula, strategizing like this is what gives you tons of flexibility early on to make better decisions later on. And it actually, let's just keep going all the way down, because I begin to see shadow shapes and a little bit of carved edges. You can see sharp edges. And do this lightly. And by lightly, I mean one layer at a time. So starting down here. And here's what I wanted to show. Just trying to grab some of that value, and we know it's darker here. So I always say, what are we doing here? We are having fun. We're finding a way to have fun with a drawing technique, a medium, a theme. But it's all about how you can find things about yourself through sort of a meditative process, in this case drawing, seeing what the paper and the water or the ink or the charcoal are doing, but also those decisions, that decision making that comes along with it. So one question to continually be asking is, yes, I'm having fun, but what other questions am I asking? Like today, my focus, is it light? Yeah, it definitely is. But beyond that, is it handling of this medium, this material, this brush? It could get very, very specific. And sometimes that's the only excuse you need. Sometimes limiting your media makes it easier. Sort of like limiting your palette. You stay pretty much in harmony. But a little bit of a clear picture of what do I want where the focus of today's experience, today's drawing, is there a question that I'm asking? A sense of presenting yourself with the problem and then finding the solution and be very satisfied by it. That's pretty much summing it up right there. Every time I add something, a line, a dot, I'm creating a problem, a new problem. So how when presented with the problem, how am I asking the question if I'm the one creating the problem, but at the same time trying to solve it? So can I ask simpler questions? That usually does the job. You ask simpler questions, not always. Sometimes, as I said, simple means more focused or more patience. So it's getting very wet over here, and I want to get into this area. But again, this area is going to pretty much bring this and this together. So let's go ahead and zoom in just a little bit. I guess piece by piece, but some of these lines, they're just beautiful. Triangles and like sort of like arrow shapes. So I want to know where my edge is. I want to add some of these little dots and lines. And there's also a bit of shifting value within some of these. Let's go ahead and do that. These are some of the sharper, and I'm doing this carefully and kind of, again, off tempo here, the timing, because I'm considering the light that I need to preserve for the later stage. So I have to take care of this one before I move on to the next. Usually you would not do this being so dark, especially right next to those areas of light. Begin to add some of that detail line that in this case would be way later, but since I'm there and it's pretty much that's it, by adding that touch right there, I think the area is done, most likely. I could just do that. And I'm doing one at a time, one line, and as I said, going from pencil right to brush. And I think this is the most effective way. And I'm using the brush and it's almost giving me exactly the texture. So the quality of line that I'm applying there, meaning the soft pattern that we tested earlier, it's really working. It's really working in terms of once I apply the brush stroke, the quality and the texture and the light and value that it's giving me. We have nice cast shadows here, and it will get a little darker once again, and this needs to get a little bit drier in order for it to work well. So having a little bit of that patience. And more. Back and forth. Starting to read a little too dark here. You consider cast shadows and reflected light. If that is what you're focused on, if you are working a light study, you really want to push that way of seeing and the technique as far as you can and really strategize. Again, ask the question. If you're not asking the question, you most likely, it could happen you stumble by accident into the answer, but that means subconsciously you were asking the questions. I believe that. But if you're not asking the question, it's a lot harder to stumble into a good answer. And that is, how do I deal with cast shadows and reflected light? Knowing what I know about my techniques, knowing what I know about this brush, this paper, this medium, how best can I achieve shifting values, simplifying what we know we're looking for. And basically create that illusion. How is that illusion conceived? Now we are moving into, let's see, this is one big one here. There's just trying to see the edge. And then from here, we have a nice curve. Believe it or not, this nice shape here is one of those elements that has a lot to say. It's one of those harsh contrast, and because of its position and its shape, I think it says it has a lot to say in terms of how it all comes together. And I mean focal points, lights and shadow. So let's make this one a nice one here. Just drag that brush, try to get that gestural effect. And again, see, gestural doesn't mean big sweeping moves. Looseness is in the mind, how you planned it, how you set it up, how you strategized. And the delivery could be really, as you can see here, right into the shadow. A matter of, in terms of rhythm, it's not fast and swooshy. It could be. And here we go. We go into the shadow with a few extra harsh folds, and we've looked. One of the greatest ways to learn to study light is fabrics. Setting yourself with any type of fabric and good lighting, where you see the transitions from light to shadow with complete abstraction, just figuring out the shapes, just like I'm trying to do here, looking at how that shadow, tiny bit of reflected light here, and I'm just going to go ahead and layer it like this, dragging some of this medium. Needs to get darker. So I guess we'll layer it once again. And while I wait, we'll work on the hand. But there it is. We're getting some of that stone. So the effect of how I applied some of that medium, remember, it was drawing it in just like the test we did earlier. But then look at this dry brush. By dragging the medium, there's some of that scumbling coming together. Maybe a little hard here and there. But notice that shift, granulation, and then that beautiful gestural technique of brush application that begins to create, as you can see, a feel of stone and a sense. You feel the difference between what would be just a block of stone and, in this case, a suit. And obviously with skin. So you see some of the gesture there. Some of the broken brush stroke. And yeah, a little bit of that value study. We'll get more into detail there. But notice here, you see shapes of shadow that basically create those forms of light. And as I look at it here, I am so far happy with the level of value. And remember, I mentioned early on, well, maybe I'll do a sky. We don't know. I mean, until I see it, the plan is, it could be that, but until I see how this works, and maybe it just works as is, there's no need for that sky blue. It could be more powerful, and there's only one way to know. That's when we go ahead and do it. So here we are. We come to this area. And as I always recommend, don't draw a hand. I know you see a hand, you see fingers, you see a pose. Try as much as possible to maintain a mindset of abstraction. You want whatever, remember, you're drawing lines, and those lines are either close to the shape that you needed to draw or not. So with the line, try to create the shape, and here we have an advantage because it's those shadow shapes. So actually, before I bring the water into this area, I'm anticipating it getting a little wetter. I'm going to draw these lines as best as I can, as many of them as I can, because once I lay down water, I won't be able to come back in until it's dry. So just to save time here, basically. And there it is. That's what it looks like in terms of what I see, in terms of lines, and I'll play and drag. Hopefully the material I added is not too heavy. I'll do some lifting if I have to. And let's go back into these we did earlier as some of our darkest shadows. We're going to go ahead and layer a little more material and try as hard as possible to not think symbolically or left brain, but isolate as much as possible the information and break it down into curves, diagonals, as it gets more and more complex with these variations of value. Remember, it is you asking and answering. You're asking the question, what is this? And if you're thinking hand or thumb, you are way, way, way ahead of yourself. You just want to ask the question in terms of simple, all the way back to basics. What's the shape of this line? What's the direction? And again, you could apply, maybe the hand is not your focus. You just want to hint. And your brain, everyone's brain, with just enough information, the essential information, will understand not just that it's a hand. Will understand, will see the pose, the expression, I'll be adding some of the detail, preserving some of the light here. They're so subtle, and it's all, this whole area is in shadow. So you have mostly, in my case, the work of how to manage all of this basic, simple, but very complex. It becomes more and more complex. Information. And again, I said gestural, so I'm going, again, something where it would take you plenty more time. This is one that I saw early, just between the index and the thumb, this nice little shadow, and Yep, I shouldn't have been saying those things. But early on when I looked, when I was strategizing and planning, it is one of those things that stood out and that I saw. And there it is. I see some of the shapes. Let's see if some of this gesture with the brush, and again, levels of moisture, here it is. Starting with the lightest area over here. Trying to get just... And I knew that was going to happen. In some areas I had too much material, so I'm going to go ahead and drag that. Lighten it. And you notice that we have good areas of light, but it's not pure bright white light. You have areas of extra light value. So drawing my brush and coming back and lifting does that effect. Adding more water. And really just understanding how you're seeing, what you're seeing, how you're asking the question once again about what you're saying. Just going to wet this entire area because there's a lot of layering that will fix some of the problems I have here with how to deal with the veins and the curves and the knuckles and all the other things that generally cause problems. So one easy way, simplify. And these simple lines and brushstrokes, I think so far are doing the job. Not fully. It will need a little revisit, a little contrast, so layering. I know will do the job. And while I let that dry, one more time, now we move into this side. This should be fine. Here's another one that I think has a lot to say. I'm kind of nervous here where some of this work, it needs to be fully dry, and that's what happens. When I find this medium and I draw onto wet, it dissolves and it does something that it's a bit out of control. It could be used as a technique, but it's not what I want here. How I'm going to break this down, very simple shapes here, but they are very telling. So we have one extra line here and one. I think this delivers the expression. And as I read the shadow, so this is all drawing. Handling of edge, handling the shape and the value. So really masterful technique is required here. Your full focus. Sometimes this is where I would switch to a way smaller brush. So I bring out my 00, controlled. See how I can control my moisture? It's going to take a little more time to go back and forth. Re-wetting. And actually, no, this is working. So we have, there it is. We have that material pulling away. We may have a little bit of mix, that wet on wet technique. Need to do lifting, and this is meticulous because of the size and the features that I'm working here. I still want to keep it gestural. And as one of you mentioned, there was a lot of controversy with this when this monument came to be, about the expression and, hey, are we really portraying the softness, kindness? Why is he so, I got to be careful not to make it look angry here, or stern, and it's all in how you handle your lines. And in this case, I'm really very careful with the curvature and shifting of value, adding a little bit of extra pattern here towards the edges, and that is to add the curvature, more gesture. And I'm going to refine some of these shifting contrasts that were basically sketched in. And if you know your technique, would I be better off just letting this dry and then drawing some of these values in instead of pushing the technique? I think this is what works best. Just keeping it consistent all the way through. It's a little riskier. But again, it allows me to apply that extra contrast and that little bit of gesture that I was trying to look for in all the other areas, that rock, the hair. So a little bit more of it right here in these fine areas of detail. Now I gotta wait till it dries a little more. Give him a little bit of a smile, just a soft smile there. And my line is getting way softer. And I have a little bit of line for eyebrow. Just a touch of that texture there that I think I can only achieve with pencil. There we are. Move over to the side, a little bit more of the roundness under the neck. And the cheek. So these softer layers, they become more and more delicate. Ears. How often do you draw an ear? And again, wrong word. Right here, you're just thinking of curves, S shapes, C shapes, but more importantly, in my case, value. Where are we? Darker, lighter. Texture. A little bit more of this scumble coming in. Now it makes much, much better and more sense. Missed a little bit of light here. You have this break between the skin and the hair. See if I could revive it with a little touch Making this darker. I gotta get specific here, so bring this in. And by making this darker, even though this is in mid-tone values, it'll read as light, that bit of curve. There it is. Now the texture quality, I gotta go back to the previous brush. Making sure you always have the right tool at hand. Kind of overdid it here a little bit, and it was wet. So by touching that, I lost a little bit of control there. More gestural brush strokes, and I am working that scumble. Now this time I'm working with the smaller brush, and I realize, wow, because it's tinier, it does give you a way better dry brush quality. So see, things that you probably should have known or forgot, or you knew but forgot. I guess I was asking the question, should I? Can I use this? Or was I just rushing through? Those are those happy accidents we talk about. And it's mostly layering, softly, patiently, texturing. This is, as always, the warning. When you begin to rush, because you feel you're almost there. I gotta test and really wait till it's dry. It's when you should be most careful. Decision making becomes, and you'll see that it's now more, there's a lot more to deal with. There's already lots of answered questions, but remember, we never run out of problems until you say, that's it, it's done. And you feel, that's it, all my questions have been answered. It is the toughest, as many artists would agree. They say, knowing when it's done. How do you know when it's done? How did you get to that conclusion? How did you know? Well, that's when you feel all my questions have been answered. So here I have interesting, very interesting, because of the shift in light and the shadows, harsher shadows, all of it in the shadow area. Either I have to go way darker, and that could be dangerous. Trying to be more precise, usually tight markings begin to appear, and that's what you do not want. Have I said it today? Looseness comes from the mind. Remembering to breathe sometimes is a good tip, especially when you feel you have to really go after what we generally think are detailed areas. And that word, the level of detail that you feel you need to achieve, it's all in the mind. So letting go. A little bit of, again, looking for that gesture, looking for the looseness. You can't force it. It has to be felt. It's a good feeling. It's like when you really feel like dancing. Sometimes, even when you don't feel like dancing, someone plays a song and you can't help it. You gotta dance. Or your body just begins to move. That level of looseness, it's from a feeling. So using comparisons, metaphors with music, and I mean it is, some say, the ultimate art, the most abstract art, and bringing that to your drawings, paintings, it's a good way. It's a good philosophy. So we reached the point now where I would generally recommend stepping back, taking closer, more analytical looks at what's going on before jumping ahead, where these decisions are costly. And final, honestly. And you saw me earlier, I was planning to use watercolor pencil for the setup and thinking of bringing in ink. But now at this point, I think it wouldn't play. Oh, forgot this one here. So if anything, I would actually go into some watercolor where I could have a little more control over some of that value, but some of this texture, some of this scumble. I'm going to bring it a little closer. A little more contrast with squints. Some of these cast shadows, a little more obvious in terms of the edge. But with patience. And there it is. Little by little layering. And realizing also that it is you representation of the theme, of the subject, of the... You are representing, which means you get to rewrite any aspect of it here. So I'm sort of basing it loosely now on what I had from the shadows, the read of the shadows. But I get to now play with them, expand on them. And right here is where I would stop, take a break, step back, give it a little space and time so I can come back to it with fresh eyes and make those final marks, the final washes, final decisions that will bring it to where it needs to be. But this is a great feeling in terms of how to handle a little bit of mixed media, thinking about bringing either the watercolor, the sky, and I think I could do something interesting with it, but I'm going to need for it to fully dry Maybe do a little bit of erasing markings here and a little final touch up with contrast. But very happy. So I hope you had fun with this. It's a beautiful way, again, to really relax your mind, focus on the simple things that you need to simplify in order to answer the questions that you're asking. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like these videos, there will be more and more coming every single week. See you next time.